Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. Today's episode sees us examine Southeast Asia for the first time, by looking at one of the most famous female political figures of the last century. Aung San Suu Kyi became an icon of democracy and human rights during her long periods under house arrest in her native Myanmar in the 1990s and 2000s. It's fair to say that, at certain times, Aung San Suu Kyi was one of the most respected people in the world, and her name became a byword for resilience and stubborn opposition to repression. However, over time, this image, which was largely constructed by a lazy international media, has proven to be unsatisfactory. Since her release from prison in 2010, Suu Kyi has shown herself to be a highly chauvinistic politician, failing to call out the Myanmar military over their appalling actions towards the Rohingya Muslim minority, and sometimes appearing unfazed by the genocide taking place. Suu Kyi's life is a great example of how far good spin and image construction can serve a person's ambitions, and just how often the press can fall for spin and unwittingly make it conventional wisdom. My guest today is Dr Ronan Lee, Research Fellow in the Institute for Media and Creative Industries at Loughborough University London. Ronan is the author of Myanmar's Rohingya Genocide, Identity, History and Hate Speech, which was released last year. We discuss Aung San Suu Kyi's early life as a member of the Myanmar elite, her time under house arrest, her response to the Rohingya Genocide, and the complex nature of her personal politics and legacy. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Aung San Suu Kyi. Hi Ronan, thanks for joining me. How are you?
Oh, really well. Enjoying the balmy British weather.
The subject of our conversation today is Aung San Suu Kyi. She was the state councillor of Myanmar between 2016 and 2021, but she's been in the public eye for much longer than that, and I think more as a political prisoner than a politician per se. I want to read a quote from a speech she gave in 1988. She said, "Power without truth can be dangerous to all. We have organised to hold public meetings on Friday. It can be successful if we hold it peacefully and with discipline. The country will never succeed if the people lack discipline. Let the world know that our people are disciplined and truthful." She spoke those words in August 1988. Can you briefly explain the context in which she was saying those words? What was happening in Myanmar in August 1988?
Well, in 1988, the military dictatorship of Myanmar was seemingly collapsing. It had been in power since 1962, so it came to power in a coup. So Myanmar, Burma, as it then was, gained independence in 1948. There was a brief period of civilian rule, and then the military undertook a coup in 1962 and held on to power until basically 1988, when their administration fell apart. The economy was a wreck. It was a shambolic state. It was, in terms of where the economy stood, it was probably worse off economically than Ethiopia, where Bob Geldof was raising money for at the time. The people were sick of the military being in control. The military had been pretty brutal, as they have always been, in terms of how they dominated the ordinary people. But the people were taken to the streets in some considerable numbers, and there was a sense that one of two things were going to happen. Either the people were going to displace the military from power, or the military was going to massacre them. And I think that the quote that you read from Aung San Suu Kyi was her signalling to the military, in fact, at that time, that the people, so ordinary civilians being in control of the government, would not necessarily represent the country falling apart, which is how the military had always portrayed the risk of civilian rule. They always presented it that if civilians are in control of the government, as they had been during the 1950s, then the country would fall apart. And Aung San Suu Kyi, I think, was signalling to the military that civilian rule would not necessarily be like that. But I think it tells us a lot about Aung San Suu Kyi as well, because it tells us exactly how concerned she was about keeping the military on side, even at that juncture. She's known outside of Myanmar not as the state councillor. I mean, if you ask people outside of Myanmar to name the state councillor of Myanmar, they'd never say Aung San Suu Kyi. She was known as a democracy icon, a fighter for human rights. I mean, that's how she was portrayed internationally. She's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and that's how people understood her. But I think in a lot of ways that involved a reading backwards, or a sort of a willful blindness to certain aspects of Aung San Suu Kyi's political career that sort of suited a narrative. I mean, in 1988, when the people took to the streets, she initially made the decision that she didn't want to get involved. She didn't want to pick a side. She made that very clear, that she wasn't picking one side or the other, and she was presenting herself initially as an honest broker between the military and the people. Now, looking back at it, most people would believe that in actual fact she led a civilian uprising or led a revolution, and that was not the case at that time. And I think had we been a little bit more mindful about her political thinking in 1988, it might have forewarned us about what she was thinking in the future.
I think there's a lot of interesting ideas there that I want to come back to. To talk a bit more about Aung San Suu Kyi's sort of earlier life, there's a subset of subjects on this podcast emerging that I think you could quite clunkily call sort of dynastical daughters. I've done podcasts on Indira Gandhi and on Sheikh Hasina, both of whom were the daughters of founding fathers of India and Bangladesh. Suu Kyi is in that sense a similar figure to those two, right?
Yeah, in many ways. I mean, we might look at female political leaders because they're rarer than men. So we might sort of categorise them in as dynastical because it's a rarer thing. So it piques our interest, and we think, I wonder if there's something to be seen here. What's clear though is that she was part of her country's elite. I mean, there's no question about that. Her father, General Aung San, remains the independence hero. He's the figure that's regarded by most people in Myanmar as having delivered the country its independence from colonial rule, and it's incredibly significant. I mean, his image was on stamps and on currency, really up until the time when Aung San Suu Kyi came onto the political scene, and then the military started to take his image away from things, not to avoid giving her political standing. Even at times when you might perceive that the military had taken control of Myanmar, her family retained a sense of an honoured place. Her mother was the ambassador to India, so Aung San Suu Kyi really grew up as the daughter of an ambassador to India, no less, which is really significant in terms of Myanmar's history. Nehru had been seen as a great supporter of Aung San's attempts to gain independence, and famously the image that's commonly seen in Myanmar of General Aung San is Aung San wearing a heavy overcoat that Nehru had gifted him before he went to London to negotiate the independence of the country. So Aung San Suu Kyi's mother is made the ambassador to India. It's an incredibly honoured role. Now, Aung San, her dad, died very early in her life. He was murdered by a political rival just months short of the country gaining its independence. So the country was on its way to independence, and then Aung San and a range of other high-level political leaders were assassinated. So at that stage, Aung San Suu Kyi would have been about 2 years old. So she really probably doesn't have any, it's unlikely she's got any actual recollection of life with her father. But she talks about how influential his politics has been on her political trajectory. She talks about that quite commonly. She's written a short biography of her dad. And she did that, I think, in about 1980, so well before she was involved in politics.
Yeah, and I think that shows a certain degree of interest in politics before the 1988 uprising as well. She, obviously this was a very privileged upbringing, and she was educated at Oxford in the 1960s. I think she worked for a time for the UN as a young woman as well. Do you think these experiences of inculcating herself in kind of these elite Western institutions, has it had a noticeable effect on her politics? Do you think you could describe her, at least at this stage, as a sort of Western liberal?
No, I don't think so. I think what's important to remember is that by the time she first got involved in politics in 1988, she was in her mid-40s. She'd spent most of her life by that stage living outside of Myanmar. So she'd had a very privileged upbringing. For a person from Myanmar at that time, she had a very privileged upbringing, but outside of the country, and had access from a very young age to influential political figures the world over. I think that that certainly gave her an understanding of how the world operated, and that's something that you would criticize. I quite often criticise the generals in Myanmar for not really understanding the world outside of the country. She certainly understood what would push the buttons of the international community, I mean the Western community in particular. That's something that she unquestionably understood. But it affected her politics in the sense that you'd never describe her as a candidate of the people, even though she's adored by the people. She's always held herself a little bit away from the public, that she operates almost on a slightly different plane to the public, that she's been, you'd almost suggest that she thinks she's been drafted or drawn into politics because of her skills, rather than been someone who's emerged organically from the people within the country.
Myanmar is a country with a very fraught history post-independence. As you mentioned, the 1988 uprising was a reaction to sort of decades of military dictatorship, very brutal military dictatorship. What was the fate of this uprising?
Well, ultimately it failed. So the military undertook a number of leadership changes through the period from the time of the uprising in 1988 right through almost till 1990. And one of the tricks that they used, strategies that they used quite effectively, was delaying. They just simply would delay decisions and delay activities. So they decided what they would do is they would announce elections to be held in 1990, and the civilian opposition agreed to participate in those elections. Now, by that stage, Aung San Suu Kyi, I think, had already been, prior to the election, she was under house arrest, so she was not free to participate in the elections, even though the party, her party, the National League for Democracy, was certainly participating, and there were people campaigning in a limited way in the country for the National League for Democracy. Now, the party won those elections, overwhelmingly won those elections. The military's proxy party was rejected, and the expectation in 1990 would have been that there would have been a transfer of power to a civilian administration. But again, that's not what the military did. What they did was they tightened up the repression, made more arrests, announced that the election result was not to elect a parliament, but to elect a committee to draft a new constitution, and proceeded on that basis. Now, hand in hand with this was a strategic decision by Aung San Suu Kyi to embrace peaceful politics, politics that rejected political violence. And it, I think, left the opposition with very few options. So, I mean, when you're faced by a shockingly violent military like we see within Myanmar that's prepared to slaughter civilians, and your decision is that the opposition will not take the military on militarily, your options are fairly limited, and ultimately they acquiesced to. Well, reluctantly they acquiesced because yes, they continued to be an opposition fighting military rule, but really the prospects that they'd be able to dislodge the military purely peacefully were I mean, I would say virtually non-existent. Now it was 2008 before there was a new constitution agreed, and that was, when I say agreed, presented by the military as the new constitution. That was a constitution that embedded military control. It gave the military a quarter of the seats in the parliament, key government ministries, an effective veto on future constitutional change. So it's the constitution that was used to give us the recent what's often been called a democratic opening, but really was nothing more than a democratic facade for ongoing and continued military rule.
You mentioned this issue of house arrest, which I think is probably the thing for which Aung San Suu Kyi is best known. She was under house arrest, I think, for 15 years after 21, after 1988-89, and the first period of that was in the early 1990s. Can you go into what was the nature of this house arrest? How restrictive exactly was this period of house arrest?
Well, sometimes it was more restrictive than at other times, and you can add another 18 months of house arrest to the list now, because she's been incarcerated basically since February 1st of 2021 when the coup was undertaken, and now she's not in house arrest, she's in jail within Myanmar. So Aung San Suu Kyi's home, where she spent most of the period, the family home on University Avenue, it's on the Inya Lake. It's a leafy part of it's in the diplomatic quarter of Yangon. It's near the United States Embassy compound, and it was the family home, and that's where she was incarcerated. Now, at various times she was able to communicate with the outside world, and at other times she was not, and her only links with the outside world would really be through her housekeeper or her visits by her lawyer. During other periods, she was able to communicate with people and would give speeches over the fence of the house, and crowds would gather to hear those speeches. But it would have been incredibly isolating. It's important, I think, to think. Many of us have been through COVID isolation. We've been through a period where we're locked down in our homes, and many people described it as house arrest. But this was not the same as that. There was no opportunity to visit the local shops once a day or once a week or anything like that, and there was no internet. And I think this is something that's really significant in terms of how we understand what incarceration and house arrest in Myanmar would have been like in the past. There was no way of really communicating with the outside world. You could hear the radio, so you might be able to listen to international news. And she actually, Aung San Suu Kyi does talk about the amount of time she spent listening to the BBC World Service. That was something that she did a lot. She played the piano, and she read books, and she meditated. But in terms of staying up to speed with political events and news, very difficult. It would have been incredibly isolating, and it would have been, I think, pretty tough psychologically to experience that. Now, I don't want to suggest that it was in any way worse than the condition of political prisoners in Myanmar in the notoriously dreadful jails in that country. It certainly physically would have been a better and mentally would have been a better situation than being in jail, but would have been incredibly isolating for her, and I think would have had an effect upon her politics and upon her thinking.
This is a part of the world, and I want to, if we have time, I want to ask you more directly about this at the end. But this is a part of the world where political assassinations are pretty rife, including, as you said, Aung San Suu Kyi's father. Did it ever cross the military's mind to just kill Aung San Suu Kyi?
Oh, many times. Yeah, many times. And there were instances when that was due to happen. The reason she was under house arrest as opposed to being in jail was that they always presented her to the public. The Myanmar military were all about controlling the narrative, and they always presented her to the public. Sometimes they would present her as a foolish pawn of Western imperial interests, married to an Englishman, the colonial devil. This is how it was presented. Presented in state media and presented very aggressively in state media as that. At other times, they presented her as a slightly foolish person who misunderstood what was going on, and that she was not really understanding what was happening in the country, and that she wasn't quite a criminal. She was just someone who did not understand the politics, and she would eventually come around to understand that what the military were doing was in the national interest. It's how the military has always presented themselves, that if you disagree with what they're doing, it's that you don't quite understand what we're doing is in the national interest, and you'll come around to us eventually. Now, in recent times, the military's view on Aung San Suu Kyi, we could talk about recent events, but in recent times, the military's view on Aung San Suu Kyi has changed. They now present her as a common criminal. There's no question that that's how they present her. That's changed since the coup in 2021. But yeah, her life was certainly at risk. One of the motivations her late husband, Michael Aris, presented for nominating her for a Nobel Prize was to keep her alive. His perception certainly was that if she was a Nobel Prize winner, it would be less likely that they would and could get away with assassinating her. And that's something that I think was a very real risk. You've got to remember as well, she was under house arrest. Her husband was very, very sick, dying, and they wouldn't let him visit the country. They wouldn't let him visit her, and they certainly wouldn't guarantee that if she left to see him outside of the country, that she'd be able to come back in. And ultimately, he passed away from cancer without having been able to see her. It had been years, I think, since they'd been able to be in the same place. Quite commonly, when they would be able to talk on the phone, the military, which were obviously listening in, would cut off the phone call at a time to create ultimate anxiety for both Aung San Suu Kyi and for her family. So her personal safety was unquestionably at risk, and I think it's at risk again. I think in recent times it's become seriously at risk.
I read when I was preparing for this that she, maybe it was a letter to Michael Aris that she'd written, but she claimed that she weighed something like 48 kilograms when she was at one point under house arrest.
Yeah, so she was denied access to medical care. Medical care in Myanmar at that time for ordinary people was pretty poor. The military administration didn't spend money on the healthcare system. It was among the worst in the world. So, like many people within Myanmar, she didn't have access to good quality healthcare or any access to a doctor. She was pretty ill at various times. While under house arrest, she's still someone who, certainly if you notice, even when she was state councillor, that she's someone who, particularly when she travels internationally, quite often she would be ill for a period of time, but before or after, which suggests someone who's still struggling with she's not in the most robust health, I think, is what I'm suggesting. That's certainly what's been indicated by the military again while she's been incarcerated since 2021, that she has medical issues, and that's of an undisclosed nature. But yeah, she was not in great shape during her period of house arrest.
I assumed before we agreed to do this episode, I thought that she was only under house arrest for sort of one long period, whereas actually she was sort of released from her house arrest a couple of times, once in 1995 and I think again in 2002. What was the rationale from the army's perspective of releasing her? I mean, you've mentioned that she was obviously very famous around the world, but she was an icon and a hero inside Burma. Was releasing her done in order to sort of placate masses of people who were sort of outraged by her incarceration?
Yeah, so at various times she was released. I mean, the military were all about staying in power, and they were all about managing opposition, and that's something that they've done pretty effectively as it happens, until February of 2021, when they've failed. I think pretty spectacularly. So they would release Aung San Suu Kyi for periods of time. They would ultimately try and do deals about what the country should be like, and they would hope that she would agree to cooperate with them. I mean, it's a hope that they had, and then she would do things that would indicate that maybe she wasn't quite going to be as pliant as they would hope, and then they would. Their leverage obviously is then that they can put her back into jail or into house arrest, and that's something that they've done a number of times over the journey. The military really, though, are about staying in power, so they used Aung San Suu Kyi for their own purposes. They weren't necessarily. I mean, you've got to remember, people within Myanmar didn't necessarily have a full grasp on how Aung San Suu Kyi was seen outside of the country. So those things were different. There's no internet. There was a heavily censored media. So really, your only way of finding out what was going on within the country was from state media or from talking to people face to face. So they would release Aung San Suu Kyi. They would then spin what that meant in state media, that this was an acceptance of their plan for the future, their plan for governing the country, and then if it didn't work, they just put her back in jail. Ultimately, I think they were hoping to break her, that she would give up and that she would walk away. I mean, I think that they hoped that she would go home to where had been her family home with her husband, which was outside of Myanmar. They hoped that she would just return to Oxford with him. And she didn't do that when the opportunity arose. And then I think they hoped that she would simply give up, and that she would decide that the situation was hopeless for her to effect change, and that she would give up, and she didn't. And as much as, I mean, I'm pretty critical of Aung San Suu Kyi's politics, but one of the things that she should be praised for is the way she stuck to it. She did take on the military. There were times when she very strongly took on the military and stuck to her guns in a way that I don't think the country's military rulers thought that she would. And I think they also struggled dealing with a woman. I think that's something they also struggled to deal with. The Myanmar military is a virtually totally male institution. It's incredibly hierarchical. I mean, if you wanted to do a study of toxic masculinity, the Myanmar military would be the worst. It would be the worst example of that. And I don't think they quite knew how they would deal with her. She was having influence as well, because of course internationally she was influential. So she was giving messages to the outside world, and there were various times when a couple of junctures that really affected how the country operated in the world. I mean, obviously there was sanctions are the of economic sanctions, the obvious thing. That she was in favour of economic sanctions, and this was something that the international community, certainly the Western community, I should say, rather than others, because China and others did not impose sanctions, but certainly the West did, and they did that on the basis that this was what Aung San Suu Kyi wanted them to do. And I think that by releasing her at various times, it was part of an attempt to try and work with Aung San Suu Kyi to see whether or not they could convince her to ask the West to remove the sanctions.
As the 90s sort of give way to the 2000s, and especially the sort of later 2000s, I think it's fair to say that the military's grip, the kind of vice-like grip that it had on the country, begins to waver a bit and begins to sort of weaken. And you obviously mentioned the 2008 constitution, the drafting of that document. And of course, Aung San Suu Kyi is eventually released from house arrest in, I think, 2010. Can you talk about some of the sort of trends that led up to that moment, and how Myanmar began to take tentative steps towards some sort of political restraint?
Well, the economy was wrecked through that whole period, and it's the sort of the underlying an underlying element to all of this. I think the war on terror, in fact, played an under-recognised role in what occurred. At various times, Myanmar was been listed as part of the axis of evil, and that's pretty. I mean, nowadays we look at that as almost a historic theme. It's quite some years ago now, but at the time it was incredibly significant in terms of the risk of regime change. And the generals, I think, were nervous about the prospects of being on that list. They really didn't quite understand how the US was calibrating its policy at the time, and we saw responses within Myanmar, like moving the capital to Naypyidaw, so moving the capital from Yangon to a new city built specifically to withstand invasion. I mean, this is a city. This was a place in the interior of the country. I mean, still, foreign embassies don't really operate there. They never did. They didn't move to Naypyidaw because, I mean, there were no people there. It's a place where you've got 6-lane highways in a country that, I mean, I don't think there'd be any other part of the country that has 6-lane highways. But it's about avoiding invasion, and it's about avoiding regime change. So that was the context for, I think, a rapprochement with Aung San Suu Kyi. There was also, I think, on the point of view of the opposition, a sense that they hadn't been able to beat the military. So the options now were simply to either accept military rule in perpetuity or to work with them in some way. Now, I think that's because under Aung San Suu Kyi's leadership, the main opposition party, the National League for Democracy, was not prepared to take the military on militarily. They weren't prepared to use political violence at all. So their options became accept military rule or work with them, and ultimately they agreed to work with them. The 2008 Constitution gave way to a pretty dicey election in 2010. When one of the generals decided that he wasn't a general anymore, Thein Sein, and he would ultimately become the president of the country, having won an election that no one would describe as free and fair, and he then ruled as president of Myanmar from 2016, from 2011, I should say, through till 2016. Now, very quickly after this notionally civilian or quasi-civilian administration comes to power, there's a negotiation with Aung San Suu Kyi. And Aung San Suu Kyi is released about a week after the election in 2010. This was so she's released. So she wasn't able to participate in the election in 2010. So there's now a kind of a quasi-civilian administration in power. But Aung San Suu Kyi's been released from house arrest. I got to meet her, in fact, that week.
Really?
When she was, I was in Yangon and was able to meet her within 3 days of her release from house arrest. I mean, I've got to be honest. I think she was as surprised as I was that we were two people that were talking about politics in Myanmar at that time. There weren't many foreigners in the country at that time. Most foreigners have been, the journalists had been expelled. The diplomats had been asked to leave the country. There were some in country, but not many. I was there on a tourist visa, and was pretty nervous, as you would be still at that time. But the opportunity to have a conversation with Aung San Suu Kyi at that time was pretty enticing. I mean, she struck me at the time as someone who was dealing with a lot. I mean, she had been just released from house arrest and was basically thrown into the leadership of the major opposition party in her country, with the expectation that would mean something in the future.
This is something that I wanted to ask you, really, was she's obviously this immensely popular, admirable figure. But she's also pretty old by this stage. I think she was 65 when she got released from house arrest. And I don't want to sound ageist, but this is a long time to be in very difficult psychological conditions. And of course, she'd never actually been a politician. She'd never run anything. Do you think that it was a mistake for her to go into politics?
My argument's always been that, ironically, in many respects, that Aung San Suu Kyi, she wants to be president. She wanted to be president of Myanmar. And she was blocked from the ability to become president. So she agreed to run in a by-election in 2012, and her party swept the board in 2012 at just over, I think, 44 by-elections held at that time. The party won virtually all of them, and she went into Parliament, and then subsequently at the next general election, they won the election. And one of the priorities post-election was changing the constitution so that she could become president, to remove this constitutional impediment that prevents her from becoming president of the country because she was married to a foreigner. Now they created a position for her, state councillor, which is effectively prime minister, and I would argue that in actual fact it would have served the military's purposes and probably would have worked for what Aung San Suu Kyi wanted, for her to be a figurehead president of Myanmar and to leave the state councillor role to someone who actually has political experience and wants to be an organiser of government, a government manager.
Because she's not an administrator, right? She's an important political figure, but she's a sort of national cultural figure rather than like an executive.
Well, she's been a terrible manager of government business. It is. I don't think that would be an unfair characterisation of how she was. There is a problem in Myanmar that many decisions will tend to be avoided and presented to someone further up the chain. I mean, if you've got a hierarchical structure in any way within Myanmar, there will be a tendency for decisions to be avoided. And that's what we saw, particularly within her political party, the National League for Democracy, that virtually every significant decision was landing on Aung San Suu Kyi's desk. So you can't run a country, you can't govern a country of 55 million people when you don't delegate power, you don't delegate authority. And I think that was something that her party over 5 years didn't do particularly well, that there were often very slow to make decisions because decisions were being held up. I mean, this is something that brings down governments in lots of places. I mean, you look at places that have struggled to make government. I mean, I remember just even thinking to an Australian government just a couple of years ago, where a big criticism was that decisions were being held up so that the Prime Minister could get involved, and it was slowing down the processes of government. I think in a lot of ways that she would have been an ideal figurehead leader. So they should have made her president, and they should have let someone who wanted to be a manager of government business become the state councillor. And I think that both the military and Aung San Suu Kyi got caught up with that debate. The military saw the title of president as something that should be kept away from Aung San Suu Kyi. And I actually think with the creation of the state councillor role, the title of president became meaningless. It became it did become a figurehead role within a prime ministerial system, because she was making all the decisions were stopping with her with the state councillor.
Do you think that the army had constructed this system in such a way as to make her look as foolish and as ineffective as possible?
I think they constructed the system to stay in power. I think that's what they did, and I think they feared that if she had the title of president, that would lead to them being slowly edged out of power. Now, I don't think that's something that she would have done, but I think they feared that if the constitutional block to her becoming president was removed, that maybe constitutional blocks to military seats in parliament might be removed next, or to other things. But I don't necessarily think that was quite the intention that Aung San Suu Kyi had. But I mean, the military, in terms of these things, are pretty risk averse. They don't want to give up anything if they can avoid giving. I mean, they've got no history of giving up any power or authority voluntarily. They just don't do it. They'll give up something if they perceive they need to, or if they perceive they can leverage it to gain something else.
I want to discuss the episode that actually, I think probably for people of my age, Aung San Suu Kyi is actually now better known for than the period of house arrest in the 80s, 90s and 2000s. And that's the Rohingya crisis. Can you go into... Well, first, can you explain who the Rohingyas are, and then can you explain what happened or started to happen in 2017?
Well, the Rohingya are a mostly Muslim ethnic minority that live in a part of Myanmar that's in Rakhine State, it's called. Historically, it was the Kingdom of Arakan, and that Arakan was, in fact, a major theatre in the Pacific War and World War II. So many people will in fact know Arakan and know historic Arakan. The Rohingya are indigenous to Myanmar. I mean, they're from, that's where they're from, but they're a Muslim group in an overwhelmingly Buddhist country, and they have been, while they were fully part of the national political fabric during the civilian era prior to 1962, they were actively excluded from society by under military rule. So from 1962 onwards, the Rohingyas' rights to citizenship, access to education, healthcare, the ability to travel, even the ability to travel from one village to another, were pretty heavily restricted by the military. And ultimately, that's culminated in a number of forced deportations, pogroms, that have at various times in the 70s, the 90s, and most recently in 2017, led to hundreds of thousands of Rohingya fleeing across the border into Bangladesh. Now, the most recent described describe. I mean, it's genocidal. I mean, there's no, as a genocide scholar, I'm pretty clear about describing it as a genocide, as the mistreatment of the Rohingya being genocide. This was the forced deportation of between 700,000 and 800,000 civilians. I mean, these are people that fled their country with horrific stories of military violence. I mean, the accounts are sickening. The military used helicopters to launch fire at the mostly bamboo villages that the Rohingya lived in. They targeted men to be murdered. They targeted educated people, so community leaders and anyone who had an education, school, if there were school teachers or people who were regarded as having some ability to lead the community. So they were murdered. They targeted women and girls for appalling sexual violence as a military tactic. This was the accounts are stomach churning, and this happened over a 2-month period in August, September, and October of 2017. I mean, to give you some idea of the scale of the displacement, people arrived in Bangladesh to sort of forested land, scrubland, where there was no one living, and created the world's largest refugee camp. I mean, this from nothing, a camp of bamboo and tarpaulin, with more people than a city the size of Dublin or Glasgow or Washington DC, arriving in the space of a couple of weeks on foot with just nothing. I mean, carrying often children or elderly relatives. I mean, it was an incredibly traumatizing experience for the victims. It's deeply affected me, having spoken with Rohingya victims shortly after. In fact, there were still people crossing the border when I was in the camps in 2017. And it was unlike previous instances of mistreatment of the Rohingya, because they'd crossed an international frontier into a country that didn't block access to the internet. We got to know what was going on. So we were pretty limited in being able to get timely images out of Myanmar. That they did arrive, but the minute people were able to access a cell phone tower, a Bangladesh cell phone tower, they're able to tell their stories to the world. So journalists were able to get at them. So all of a sudden, there was a face to the violence. So this was top news in the world in 2017. I mean, it was huge news.
And I think equally large news later was the role of Aung San Suu Kyi in this. How did Aung San Suu Kyi react to what was going on? As you said, this wasn't a new phenomenon. The Rohingyas had been, discriminated against for a very long time. But now that she was in a position of sort of relative power and authority, how did she react?
Well, initially she didn't react. I mean, that was the odd thing. So there was a 4-week period where there was really no statement from Aung San Suu Kyi. I mean, at this point, she was the state councillor of Myanmar, so she's the effective prime minister of the country. Her country's military is genocidally forcibly deporting hundreds of thousands of people into an adjacent country. And there was no reaction from imagine that happening anywhere else where there's no reaction from the Prime Minister. 4 weeks into the crisis, she made a speech. She made a speech that was broadcast within Myanmar and was viewed internationally, where she, in fact, defended the military's approach. She described media accounts of atrocities as a huge. I mean, the quote from her. I mean, this is not people putting words in her mouth. These were her words. She described it as a huge iceberg of misinformation, and it was a strong endorsement from her of what the military was doing. I mean, the problem was she was the one person in the country who had the political standing call upon the military to exercise some restraint.
So why didn't she?
Well, I think, when people are in politics, they always present their bad decisions as things that they did because they were in some way constrained. I mean, that's always how you spin your bad decision after the fact. I think the reality is that she was not unhappy with the military's decision. I mean, I think it's very hard to read this in any other way than she made the decision that she was not prepared to take on the military in any way at that time, that she possibly had other political priorities, and they were changing the constitution. Maybe she had a view that there was a long-term process that would diminish military rule, and ultimately she regarded the Rohingya as an expendable community. I mean, she's an ethnic Burma Buddhist nationalist in many ways. I mean, that's her politics. I mean, she represents a political party that during its term of office was widely criticised by ethnic minorities for having not rescinded the sorts of Burmanization policies. So it's a rolling out of a sort of a hegemonic ethnic Burma identity throughout Myanmar. She was criticised by ethnic minorities for not having rescinded many of those policies. There was some quite unfortunate incidents where there was a bridge that was to be named after her father in an area where locals regarded him, quite frankly, as a war criminal, and she and her party proceeded with these symbolic decisions that you would only do, I think, if you felt that it was something that needed to be done. And that was always the military's line. Their line was always that we are representing the country in the way that it should be represented, and ethnic minorities should regard themselves as welcomed guests who should row in with what the majority want.
When I was thinking about this before we started, I suspected that the reason that she had sort of downplayed this was that basically what you said originally, right? That she was concerned for her own position. She wanted to stay in power. She didn't want to annoy the military, and so she basically turned a blind eye to this. But what you've said there is actually slightly... It's not that charitable, really. It's actually a worse thing.
No, yeah, I mean, I think that that is certainly my position on where she is. I see her. I mean, I would, as a scholar, I see her as a Burma nationalist, and someone who is happy to use the Rohingya politically. I mean, she's shown no real desire to resolve their human rights concerns. I mean, bearing in mind throughout the entire period of Aung San Suu Kyi's rule, there were about between 120 and 140,000 Rohingya in concentration camps within Rakhine State. Now, they'd been displaced from their homes in 2012 and were confined to camps at that time and weren't allowed to leave. Now, they were in those camps on the day Aung San Suu Kyi became state councillor, and they remained in those camps on the day she was arrested most recently by the military in 2021. So if you're prepared to tolerate, I mean, and I'm not trying to overplay what these camps are. These are civilians. These are not people who've committed any crime. These are just ordinary people who have been put in camps surrounded by barbed wire, and there seems to be no plan for allowing them to return to their former homes. So no, I'm not. I don't think it's appropriate to give a charitable reading. Although I'll give you what the charitable reading would be. The charitable reading would be that Aung San Suu Kyi felt in 2017 that if she called on the military to restrain themselves during their genocidal rampage through Rohingya civilian communities, that they would immediately launch a coup and remove her from power. I mean, that's the charitable reading of things. But I mean, you've got to ask a very basic political question. If calling on a military to restrain its genocidal impulses leads them to remove you from power, really, what power do you have?
Yes.
Other than the title, other than the office, other than the car with the driver, and invitations to important events. And I think the notoriety that the Rohingya crisis gained in 2017 actually would have insulated Aung San Suu Kyi against a coup at that time, because I don't think it would have been possible for the Western community not to have intervened to defend Aung San Suu Kyi's government had she called for restraint and that prompting a military coup. Now, of course, what happened was she didn't call for restraint. She defended the military. She trashed her international reputation. She demonstrated to the military that really she was pressurable. And I think that ultimately that's what led to the coup, and certainly led to the coup in 2021. There was no sense on the part of the military that there would be any international response. And the fact that the international community didn't respond militarily in 2017 almost guaranteed that they wouldn't interfere in 2021. Because how do you justify? I mean, if you're now, there'd been a change of US president, of course, and the President Biden had just come into office when the coup was launched. But if you're a Western power, how do you justify putting boots on the ground to defend Aung San Suu Kyi's government in 2021 if you weren't prepared to put boots on the ground to protect Rohingya civilian victims of genocide in 2017? And I think it was a bad. I mean, at a basic political level, I think Aung San Suu Kyi made a very bad political decision throughout this period.
As you said, she's back in prison now after the coup that happened 18 months ago, more or less. Just to finish, I wanted. This was something that you mentioned right at the start about her international reputation. Do you think that the West really misjudged her in the sort of early days? And if you do, why do you think they did that? I mean, this is obviously a country which is very far away, geographically and culturally from Europe and from North America. Do you think it's fair to say that they sort of caricatured her as just a kind of icon for democracy in a place where there was very little democracy? You think that was just a very easy sell? That it was good for the television cameras, it was good for the newspapers, and they just sort of did that?
Yeah, partly. I mean, partly as well that she and her party and her family very actively presented that image to the world. I mean, it's very, very important to remember her husband feared greatly that she would be assassinated. And he was working outside the country to present her image to the world. I mean, this is a country that, I mean, while it borders India and China, which is pretty significant, it really isn't well known, and the intricacies of life in Myanmar really wouldn't have been well known to people in Europe, certainly North America. So she was someone you could get behind. I mean, would have been very different, I think, in terms of the international response if she was advocating shooting at soldiers. I think that there might have been a very different Western response to the politics. I mean, but when you've got a political opposition that's promoting a peaceful transition and a peaceful response to a military regime, that's a pretty captivating thing. And I think it prompted people not to dig much further into her politics, to not really think too much about what else she might stand for. The idea that she would in the future find herself running a government, I think was beyond many people's expectation. And 2010, I mean, it was certainly not something that was immediately on the cards even in 2010. And there was a big change. I mean, there was an agreement. She agreed to participate. It was a constitution that they considered to be illegitimate and had very actively called illegitimate, but she agreed, and her party agreed to participate in by-elections in 2012 and in the general election in 2015. I mean, that was a compromise on her part and her party's part that, of course, brought them into government. But by then, the West really hadn't considered exactly what that might mean. I mean, beyond a belief in democracy, what did she stand for? And I think that's where some of the surprise came from. And I think from her point of view, I think some of the shock that she expressed at the criticism that she was now receiving from the West, because her views I think in her mind, her views hadn't changed at all. I mean, from her point of view, she was the one that was utterly consistent. It was other people had misjudged her or had imposed thoughts on on her and what she might stand for and how she might run a government.
Ronan, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed that. If people want to read more about Myanmar or about Aung San Suu Kyi or about what you've written about those two topics, and I know that you've obviously written a lot about the Rohingyas, where can they go?
Oh well, in terms of places to go, there's a pretty good expatriate media out of Myanmar. So there's a diaspora media. Frontier Myanmar is a really great publication that I strongly recommend, and you can find them online. There's a reading list, in fact, that's been published in the last couple of weeks by The Economist newspaper with 7 or 8 good quality books to read about Myanmar, including my own about the called Myanmar's Rohingya Genocide, which is sort of first-person accounts of what occurred in 2017. So the Rohingya in their own words.
I was wondering when you were going to get to your own book. I did hope you were going to get to it.
I thought I should. I just thought I should mention it. Well, and
that's why I ask people.
You possibly know, banned in Myanmar, banned by the
really,
state.
That must be a bit of a badge of honour.
Well, that's what people keep saying, but it feels the opposite. I mean,
but then people can't read it.
It means people can't read it. So state media made a really interesting announcement, but it's some weeks ago now. Announcing the name of the book and naming me, and they arrested a bookseller for offering it for sale. I mean, it kind of shows you how they're trying to stop people learning about what's going on in the country. I mean, they want to cover up their crimes. There's no question about that. That's how the military in Myanmar operates. They really want to cover up their crimes. But it was unusual to make the decision to name a scholarly book.
It's in the limited reading I've done about it. It just seems like a country where there's such little press freedom. I mean, Ronan, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed speaking to you. So, cheers. Take care.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, so you never miss new content.